Hello, everyone. My name is John Mead Jr., and I am a community engagement consultant with NASDAQ, focusing on data, evaluation, and learning. If you're watching this video, this means you are either working at a local, state, or tribal health department or at a community-based organization. I want to thank you for utilizing this resource to prioritize community engagement in your ending the HIV epidemic efforts. As we all know, data is an essential part in identifying gaps in policy and programming, but the way you collect and report the data to community stakeholders is also crucial in order to not re-traumatize or stigmatize certain communities. This section of the Community Engagement Toolkit will highlight videos from community leaders working to end the HIV epidemic in Southern jurisdictions. Our first special guest is Justin Smith. Hi, Justin, how are you?
I'm well, John. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm doing great. Thank you for joining us and allowing us to interview you and pick your brain about how health departments can better engage different communities when it comes to data evaluation and learning.
Well, it's great to be with you.
So what are your initial thoughts or feelings when data monitoring evaluation come up as it relates to HIV prevention?
So data is one of the most central elements that we can look to help guide our decision making about how we respond to HIV within our communities. We have to ensure that we have high quality data. We have to make sure that we have data that is actionable. And we also have to make sure that we have data that is complete. And there are lots of different elements to kind of all of those components. So I think, first of all, for many people, when you hear data, people's eyes just kind of glaze over. And, I think part of what we have to do a better job is, data is a way that you can tell the story, right? And so I think not just about the quantitative epi data that is sort of core to what we do in public health and in the HIV response, but it's also important that we complement that information with qualitative methods, ensure that we can kind of tell a richer narrative of what's happening, because I think that's actually how you might better engage the community. Because if they just see numbers, that tells one part of the story. But I think when you actually hear what those numbers mean in terms of how people experience it, that makes a lot of difference. And so I think that's an area that we need to continue to grow and push, kind of doing the work of public health departments. I also think that it's important that we do a better job of making sure that we collect information on lots of different key populations that have historically been left out of the conversation, but that we know are at risk for HIV. And that, when I think about that, the trans community really comes foremost in my mind, and that, we don't have a lot of great data as it relates to trans communities and HIV. And that's certainly a gap that needs to be filled and filled quickly. So I think, that's another element that we have to sort of dive into a little bit more, which is making sure that we have data that is reflective of all the communities. And then we want to make sure that we're collecting data that actually allows us to take action. So it's not enough to just collect the data and sort of show the disparities that we know that have existed for essentially since the start of the epidemic, and not sort of be compelled to act on that, right? So I think that is the other place where we need to do a better job of not just sort of replicating the studies that show, disparities by race in HIV. It's important to kind of track how we're making progress against closing those disparities, but just kind of replicating the narrative of these disparities exist, like we've known that. So, so that's the last thing I'll say is that I think data is important, but we also have to make sure that we marry the data with appropriate action. And I think that's where the work of us in public health really comes into play.
So, in what ways can local, state, or tribal health departments involve more community stakeholders like yourself in the data collection, monitoring, and evaluation process?
That's a beautiful question. I think that there are a lot of different ways that we can see how that can look. One thing that I really like is the idea of ensuring that people that are part of the local community are involved in the actual collection of the data. So, and that can look like a lot of different things. That can look like, making sure that you're hiring people from the community that represent the various populations that you're attempting to collect information in conjunction with, that they're represented not just in the folks that are, actually doing the surveys themselves, but are also involved in the analysis of that information and also in the interpretation. I think one of the things that the Zoom kind of virtual world has opened up for us is that we can do more intentional conversations with our community through these technological tools. So as an example, you might think about if there's a local organization that works with Black gay men, for example, as a health department, you might be able to do some type of subcontracting process where folks are kind of hired through that entity to actually work in data collection. That serves two purposes. It provides a level of investment in the organization, and you're also helping to build the capacity and the skills of people in the community to actually be able to interpret and understand data. So that's a really important value add. The next thing is thinking about how, when you actually get the data, how do you tell the story that the data kind of gives rise to? And you can do that through a process, what we call interpretive community, where you do sort of a presentation where you're actually not presenting the data as a finished product, but as a point to start a conversation. And you invite community members to actually comment and help make meaning of what the data actually say. And that way you can kind of incorporate that into the report. The last piece would be in the delivery of whatever final information. I use that sort of in quotes because data is always really just the start of a journey. But just thinking about how do you actually get that information back out to the communities that provided the input for that data. And that requires that you think about going beyond the traditional mechanisms through which public health communicates its findings. So, scientific journal articles are amazing, and it's important to make sure that we are building the evidence base, but we also know that most of the folks that we want to inform with our data are not going to access those journals for a whole host of reasons, because if you don't have sort of an institutional affiliation, those journals are not something that you have ready access to. Also, the way that those articles are written are not sort of accessible to sort of a general population. So thinking about how do you turn this into information that's actually translatable. And I think that we're learning in public health that is a muscle that we need to continue to flex. As we've seen with the COVID pandemic, the importance of being able to take complex public health information and summarize it in things like Instagram posts, Facebook posts, in ways that are digestible, because that's where people are actually going to consume the information. So I think it involves having some very thoughtful conversations about what that translation looks like, and making sure that you have the capacity to do that type of translation and packaging beyond sort of the more traditional methods. Because I think one of the things that helps to build the trust that we need to make sure that we're building in public health and in HIV in particular is that we're being in constant dialogue with our communities, right? So oftentimes when you think about politics, candidates are criticized because it's like, well, you only come around to our community when you need something. We don't want to replicate that type of system in our public health efforts. So it's really about having this more ongoing dialogue so that, you really are, as a public health department, seen as just another important institution in the community that people will learn to trust. And that takes time. So, depending on where you are in the country, the relationship that communities have with a health department can be very different, right? There are some communities that have a history of very strong ties with health departments and others not so much, right? And so I think it's also important for you as someone that works in a health department to kind of understand what is the relationship that this particular institution has with the communities that we serve, and kind of understanding what that looks like, right? And that can at least give you a sense of what is the gap between where you are and where you'd like to be in terms of the level of trust that communities might have with your specific health department. So I think it's important to just have a level setting, or at least an understanding of what that looks like, because that gives you a sense of like, what is the work that needs to happen. But in a nutshell, I think it's about making sure that you have that more continual engagement and conversation with the communities that you as a health department are accountable to.
Are there certain questions that should be asked or topics that should be addressed when health departments collect data from community members regarding the ending the HIV epidemic efforts?
Sure. I think one area that we should try to lean into is really understanding the impact of racism and how that shows up in the work of health departments. And so that kind of ties back to what I said earlier about understanding what is the relationship between your health department and the particular constituencies that you're accountable to and trying to serve. So when we think about, Black folks, Latinx folks, Asian folks, there are various histories of mistreatment at the hands of public health. And understanding kind of within your particular community, what does that mean for how people view the health department? And I think that is an important just kind of internal work that folks need to do. And so I think asking questions that surface that, right? And really trying to make sure that, we are naming and aware of the racism that exists within the systems that we work in. And not just racism, but thinking about kind of all the other intersectional oppressions that we know show up in how people access public health and healthcare in general. So I think, again, as a way of trying to build trust is just asking some of those questions, right? And I think that, NASDAQ and others have been working on developing toolkits of specific survey items that you might think about asking. And so just trying to make sure that you're, as a health department, aware that those tools exist and trying your best to incorporate that into the HIV work that you're doing. Because I think that part of it is about, rebuilding trust and engendering trust and keeping trust. I think it's not just as much as saying that, these communities that we're trying to work with, they don't trust us. I think it's a part of understanding as a health department, what are we doing that makes us trustworthy, right? And so part of building that trust is actually opening up a conversation with communities. And that starts with things like naming racism where it exists, right? And so even asking the question opens up a different type of conversation that begins the process of healing and trying to understand what communities need and want from their health department. So I think that's kind of one domain of questions. I also think that thinking about how do we incorporate more qualitative assessment so that we understand that narrative piece. I believe that obviously the epi data is core to public health, but I think we also need to tell the story of what's happening within communities. And so some of those more qualitative dimensions can be helpful in helping us to unpack some of these deeper issues that impact our work in public health.
Thank you so much, Justin, for your time and your work, especially in Atlanta, for pushing this forward. And I appreciate your time here today.
Thank you so much, John.